Something unexpected just happened in the middle of a growing economic battle, and it may have completely changed the balance of power between two of the world's closest allies. Because only moments ago, a development involving Canada and former U.S. President Donald Trump sent shockwaves through political and economic circles. What looked like a powerful trade strategy suddenly began to collapse. And the person who revealed the stunning details was none other than veteran political host Rachel Maddow. During a tense broadcast, Maddow walked viewers through a series of events that many people had completely missed. Events that, when connected together, painted a picture far different from what the public had been told. But to understand why this moment is so dramatic, we need to rewind just a little. Because the roots of this story go back to one of the most controversial economic battles in modern North American politics: the trade war. When Donald Trump first launched aggressive tariffs against multiple countries, the goal was simple: force trading partners to renegotiate deals, bring manufacturing back to the United States, and prove that America had the leverage in global trade. But when those tariffs began hitting imports from Canada, something unusual happened. Instead of immediately backing down, Canadian leaders began quietly preparing a counter-strategy. And at first, almost nobody noticed. The public saw the headlines: tariffs, retaliation threats, political speeches. But behind the scenes, economic officials in Ottawa were studying something much deeper: supply chains, trade dependencies, and most importantly, timing. According to analysts referenced during Maddow's segment, Canadian strategists understood something critical. The United States and Canada are deeply connected economically. Trillions of dollars in goods move across the border every year. Energy, automobiles, agriculture, technology components. This means any trade conflict between the two countries doesn't just hurt one side, it creates pressure across the entire system. And this is where things started getting interesting. Because instead of responding with immediate dramatic retaliation, Canadian officials reportedly began targeting very specific pressure points: industries located in politically sensitive regions, products tied to influential lobbying groups, and supply chains that American companies depended on heavily. But that wasn't even the most surprising part. Because while the trade war headlines dominated television screens, Canadian negotiators were quietly working on something else entirely: alternative partnerships, new trade routes, and expanded economic cooperation with other global markets. In other words, while the conflict was escalating publicly, Canada was preparing an exit strategy, a way to reduce its dependence on American markets if tensions continued. And according to the analysis revealed during Maddow's broadcast, that preparation changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Because once Canada began shifting parts of its trade network outward, the leverage equation started to shift. Slowly at first, but then more noticeably. American exporters began raising concerns. Manufacturers warned about supply disruptions. Farm groups started sounding alarms about lost market access. And suddenly, the political pressure inside Washington began growing. But what happened next stunned many analysts watching the situation unfold. Because at a critical moment in the negotiations, Canadian leaders made a move that few people expected. Instead of escalating tariffs further, they changed the narrative. They focused on stability, on long-term economic cooperation, on presenting themselves as the calm and predictable partner in the relationship. Meanwhile, the trade conflict continued generating uncertainty inside American markets. And uncertainty is something investors hate. That contrast began shaping global perception. International businesses looking for reliable trade partners started paying attention. Some quietly shifted investment. Others reconsidered supply chains. And gradually, the political pressure surrounding the trade conflict began building inside the United States itself. But according to Maddow's analysis, this was only the surface of what was really happening. Because the real turning point came during a series of behind-the-scenes negotiations that never fully made headlines. Negotiations where Canadian officials reportedly leveraged their growing international partnerships to strengthen their position. And that is where things became truly dramatic. Because suddenly, the strategy that was supposed to force concessions from Canada appeared to be producing the opposite effect. Instead of weakening Canada's position, it was encouraging diversification. Instead of isolating Canada economically, it was pushing Ottawa to strengthen ties elsewhere. And this is the moment when the narrative surrounding the trade war began to shift. Quietly at first, but unmistakably. Political analysts started noticing it. Business leaders began talking about it. And media outlets slowly started asking the same question. Had the strategy backfired? But just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get more complicated, another detail surfaced that made the entire story even more fascinating. A detail that many viewers watching Maddow's broadcast almost missed. Because buried inside the discussion was a reference to a specific negotiation moment that insiders now describe as the real turning point in the entire trade conflict. A moment where Canada reportedly held far more leverage than anyone expected. And what happened during that moment may have completely reshaped the outcome of the trade war. But the full story behind that turning point is even more surprising. Because according to analysts familiar with the negotiations, the move that changed everything was not loud. It wasn't dramatic. And it didn't happen in front of television cameras. It happened quietly. Strategically. And when the implications finally became clear, it sent shockwaves through Washington. Because the country that many believe would be forced to make concessions suddenly appeared to be holding the stronger hand. And what happened next left political observers asking a question that is still being debated today. Did Canada just outmaneuver one of the most aggressive trade strategies in modern American politics? Or was something even more complicated unfolding behind the scenes? Because the next phase of this story reveals a twist that almost nobody saw coming. And once you understand that twist, the entire trade conflict looks completely different.
But the turning point that changed everything didn't happen during a press conference. It didn't happen during a dramatic political speech. And it certainly didn't happen in front of television cameras. Instead, according to analysts referenced during the broadcast, the real shift happened quietly during a series of negotiations that took place far away from the public spotlight. And this is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Because while the public narrative focused on tariffs and retaliation, Canadian officials were reportedly working on a strategy that few people expected, a strategy built around patience, economic leverage, and timing. According to observers following the negotiations closely, leaders in Canada understood something very important about the structure of the North American economy. The relationship between Canada and the United States is not one-sided. It is deeply interconnected. Every day, billions of dollars in goods cross the border. Automobile parts assembled in one country are finished in the other. Energy supplies move across pipelines that link entire industries. Agricultural products flow through shared distribution networks. In other words, disrupting trade doesn't hurt just one side. It shakes the entire system. And this is exactly where Canadian negotiators reportedly found their advantage. Instead of escalating the conflict dramatically, they began highlighting something that many American business leaders were already worried about: uncertainty. Companies that rely on cross-border supply chains depend on stability. Investors want predictable trade environments. Manufacturers want consistent access to parts and materials. When those systems are threatened, pressure begins building quickly. And according to analysts, that pressure started appearing inside the United States itself. Major business groups began quietly urging policymakers to resolve the dispute. Industry associations warned that prolonged tariffs could damage American manufacturing. Farm groups raised concerns about losing access to Canadian markets. Suddenly, the trade war was no longer just a geopolitical confrontation. It was becoming a domestic economic issue. But that wasn't even the most surprising part. Because while these economic pressures were building, Canadian officials were simultaneously strengthening economic ties with other global partners. Trade agreements, export opportunities, new investment channels. Each move gradually reduced Canada's dependence on the American market, and that shift changed the balance of the negotiations. Instead of appearing isolated, Canada began looking increasingly flexible, adaptable, resilient. Meanwhile, the pressure on Washington continued to grow. And this is where things became politically complicated, because the aggressive tariff strategy had been designed to force concessions from America's trading partners. But now analysts were beginning to question whether the opposite was happening. Was the pressure actually pushing allies away? During the broadcast, Rachel Maddow pointed to several economic indicators that suggested the trade battle was producing unintended consequences. Supply chain disruptions, price fluctuations, investment uncertainty, each one adding new layers of pressure to the situation. But the moment that truly caught analysts by surprise came during one particular negotiation phase. According to insiders familiar with the discussions, Canadian officials entered the talks with far stronger leverage than many observers expected. By that point, alternative trade arrangements had already begun taking shape, export markets had diversified, and international partners were watching the situation closely. That meant Canada had options, more options than many people realized. And when those options became clear during negotiations, the dynamic reportedly shifted almost instantly. Suddenly, the strategy that was meant to pressure Canada looked far less effective. Instead of forcing rapid concessions, it had triggered adaptation, economic adjustment, and political resistance. But what happened next stunned many people watching the story unfold, because rather than celebrating or escalating the confrontation, Canadian leaders took a surprisingly measured approach. They emphasized cooperation, stability, and the long-term importance of the US-Canada partnership. This move changed the tone of the entire conversation. Instead of appearing combative, Canada began presenting itself as the responsible actor seeking stability in global trade, and that message resonated far beyond North America. International observers started seeing the situation differently. Investors began reassessing risk. Political analysts began asking whether the strategy driving the trade conflict had actually strengthened Canada's position instead of weakening it. But the real twist in this story came from something very small, something many viewers almost missed during the broadcast, because buried inside the analysis was a reference to a quiet shift that had been taking place within American political circles. Lawmakers from several states began expressing concerns about the economic impact of the tariffs. Business leaders increased lobbying efforts for trade stability, and suddenly the pressure surrounding the trade conflict was no longer just coming from foreign governments, it was coming from within the United States itself. That internal pressure began reshaping the political landscape, because trade wars may start as international confrontations, but they are often resolved through domestic political realities, and when industries, workers, and investors begin feeling economic uncertainty, political leaders eventually face growing pressure to find solutions. This is the dynamic Maddow highlighted during her analysis, a dynamic where the confrontation that once looked like a powerful negotiation tactic had gradually turned into a complex economic and political challenge. But the most important question still remains unanswered. Was this outcome the result of a carefully calculated Canadian strategy, or was it simply the natural consequence of how interconnected global trade has become? Because in modern economics, leverage rarely belongs entirely to one side. Supply chains link countries together in ways that make unilateral pressure difficult to sustain, and that reality may be the biggest lesson from this entire episode. Trade wars can start quickly. They generate dramatic headlines. They dominate political debates. But the deeper economic systems beneath those headlines are far more complicated, and sometimes those systems produce outcomes that nobody fully anticipated. For now, the debate continues. Supporters of the tariff strategy argue it forced important conversations about trade fairness. Critics say it exposed the risks of aggressive economic confrontation with close allies. But regardless of which interpretation proves correct, one thing is clear. The confrontation between Canada and the United States revealed just how fragile and interconnected the modern global economy really is. And the next time leaders consider launching a trade war, they may remember how quickly the balance of leverage can change. Because sometimes the strongest move in geopolitics isn't the loudest one. Sometimes it's the quiet strategy unfolding behind the scenes, while the rest of the world is focused somewhere else.